As you begin that chapter, you have a prayer of praise for what God is going to do, or will do. Then he sets forth the sad condition of the people in verses 7 through verse 9. He tells us about Assyria's end in verses 10 through 12. And as a result of that, the awe that comes from God's mighty work in verses 13 through 16. In verses 17 through verse 22, which that section that we were studying last week, the deliverance and blessing of God. And in verse 17, he tells us, "Thine eye shall see the king in his beauty. They shall behold the land that is very far off." And so Isaiah is looking to the future here when the righteous will see the king in his beauty. And I believe that that is an obvious reference to Jesus and the Christ and the beauty of his life and what he has done for us, along with his kingdom. Then in verse 18, when he says, "Thine eye shall meditate terror," or "thine heart shall meditate terror. Where is the scribe? Where is the receiver? Where is he that counteth the towers?" While verse 17 dealt with what the eyes would see, in verse 18 he changes to what the heart will meditate upon. The heart meditates on these things. Whereas in verse 17, the eyes seeing something. During the Messianic age, and I believe that that's what these verses are dealing with, this Messianic age, those during this age can look back on history and learn the great lessons that God has preserved for us. And in particular, the past deliverance from the enemy and the terror they caused. If you remember Romans 15 and verse 4, that the things, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we through patience and comfort of the Scriptures might have hope. Those things written aforetime there were those things written during the Old Testament period, and thus these things that we're studying. And he says they're written for our learning. So that's why we go back and we study the Old Testament and we try to learn from it. We learn the principles that are there. And here we're saying the deliverance that God brought upon Israel, his people, from the enemy, and specifically now, or at this period of time, Assyria, that he's dealing with. These events would be but a distant memory for them, but the heart meditates upon. Meditating, and I think I might have mentioned this before, the word comes from a word which means and deals with speaking softly. Almost a murmuring type. Where, have you ever seen someone so deep in thought that they're talking basically to themselves, not even realizing, they're actually saying words? That's the idea of meditating. We are thinking so intently on these things that everything else is pretty much blocked out. Here's thus the heart meditating terror. the scribe that he's talking about would be that individual who takes account of the spoil. The receiver would be the one who, and I think New King James has weights, and the American Standard says weighted. It'd be the one who weighs out the tribute that had been paid, weighing the gold, the silver. If you remember, Sennacherib had placed upon Hezekiah a tribute of 30 talents of gold, 300 talents of silver. Took the tribute money and still demanded their surrender. Well, someone has to weigh out the gold and weigh out the silver. That's the receiver, the one who receives that, putting it out into the balance and weighing it carefully. So you had one person weighing the tribute, another person who would actually make a record of it. So you have two people, basically, one weighing it out, the other person making keeping a balance sheet on it, if you would. The one who counted the towers would be the ones that were sent to a city, and they would observe the number of towers that the city had. And then the towers, of course, were places of fortification for the city. It would indicate the strength of the city. The city, well, I think about, back in Joshua chapter 7, they had just taken Jericho. They sent a group of basically spies to see about Ai. And they're told, you don't need to send the whole army there. Just a few thousand will take care of it. Why? Because they had seen the strongholds of that city. Of course, they didn't recognize that God was in control, and because of sin in the camp, they were defeated by the men of Ai. Until they got rid of the sin in the camp. And then they were able to take the city. But there's the spies being sent out. Why? To see, here's the stronghold. Here's how strong the city is. Here's how many men that we might need to defeat this city. And so they would also kind of look at it and observe it to see, here's where the stronghold is, here's where the weaknesses are. If we're going to attack, we might want to attack over here and not over here. Why? Because they've got a stronghold here, but it's kind of the defenses are weak over on this side. So they would look at those things and observe those things. They were counting the towers in that sense. Well, what he's setting forth in verse 18 is that all of these, the scribe, the receiver, the counted the towers, all of these people, where are they now? They're gone. They have fled away. They've perished. God has delivered the city for them. And so all of these individuals, they don't exist anymore. As either they're dead or they've retreated back to Assyria. All right. In this case, probably not prison, but probably these individuals probably would have retreated back with Sennacherib to Assyria. The people would be able then to sing that great psalm of Psalm 48. And I thought about just reading verses 12 and 13 because that really expresses it. But it's not that long of a psalm. And it is a psalm that I've titled Jerusalem is Glorified. In the first 8 verses, the God of Jerusalem, he's to be praised, verse 1. He's or the beauty of the city because God dwells there in verses 2 and 3. God defends the city, making it secure in verses 4 through verse 8. God's people are blessed then by him in verses 9 through 14. And you see in verse 9, they're meditating on God's love. Verses 10 and 11, the praising God for his righteous judgments. Verses 12 and 13, the beauty of the city. And then in verse 14, God's presence in the city. And so that's kind of an overview now than just to read it. Great is the Lord, greatly to be praised, in the city of our God, in the mountain of his holiness. Beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion. On the sides of the north, the city of the great King. God is known in her palaces for refuge. For lo, the kings were assembled. They passed by together. They saw it, and so they marveled. They were troubled and hasted away. Fear took hold upon them there, and pain as of a woman in travail. Thou breakest the ships of Tarsus with an east wind. As we have heard, so have we seen. In the land of the Lord of hosts, in the city of our God, God will establish it forever. Selah. We have thought of thy loving kindness, O God, in the midst of thy temple. According to thy name, O God, so is thy praise unto the ends of the earth. Thy right hand is full of righteousness. Let Mount Zion rejoice. Let the daughters of Jerusalem be glad because of thy judgments. Walk about in Zion and go round about her. Tell the towers thereof. Mark ye well her bulwarks. Consider her palaces, that ye may tell it to the generation following. For this God is our God forever and ever. He will be our guide even unto death. It's a beautiful psalm, but it's praising the city of Jerusalem. That God is the God of Jerusalem. And he has spared Jerusalem. He has made the nations that came against it to fear and to retreat. So that's basically what we're seeing here. The people who were taking tribute and recording it, the people who were looking out at the city to consider its weaknesses and its strengths, they've all fled. Where are they? They're gone. Because God has blessed that great people. Now we say, going back to Romans 15 and 4, these things were written for our learning. What a great lesson that we learn, not about the physical city of Jerusalem back, at that period of time, but what about that heavenly city of Jerusalem, which is the church of the living God? God will defend it. God will take care of it. God will protect us if we are faithful to him. And while we might endure persecution and suffering, yet we can continue on through it, and we can be successful in all that we do because God is with us. So we learn that lesson here. God has the power to take care of his people, and he will do so. In verse 19 then, thou shalt not see a fierce people, a people of a deeper speech than thou canst perceive, of a stammering tongue that thou canst not understand. So again, you're not going to see them. Why? Because they're gone. The fierce people would be the Assyrians. To some extent, it might have reference to the Babylonians, and later on a possible inclusion of the Romans, the Roman Empire. And as some have pointed out, even anti-Christian hosts, even today. But they're gone. They're a fierce people. Their words were gruff words, gruff speech that was not really intelligent to the Jews. Someone read Isaiah 28 and verse 11. Isaiah 28 and verse 11. Okay, stammering lips and another tongue. Now, that had reference probably to their being taken into Babylonian captivity. They were taken and they were being taught by God by a nation that had, to them, stammering lips. They were another tongue. But it was unintelligible to the Jews. Just as illustration, if the Chinese were to take over the United States and they started speaking Chinese, how many of us would understand it? It would be like stammering lips, wouldn't it? Because we'd have no understanding of their language. That's basically the Israelites in relationship to the Assyrians. They didn't understand their language. It would be non-intelligible to them. The generation that saw the destruction of the Assyrian army by the hand of God, where 185,000 die in one night, probably did not see the Assyrians again. We know that they left, went back to Nineveh, and later on Sennacherib was murdered by his sons. But as far as we know, they never saw them again. Not as an army, not as a people likened to that. So, thou shalt not see a fierce people. They were a fierce people. Again, we have in our society strong opposition to the church, to spiritual matters. You could talk about it from the standpoint of Christendom as a whole. And I'm not saying those who are simply the Lord's church, but all of those denominations that would claim to be of Christ. We know that they're not, but there's great opposition to that. And the opposition is very strong. They are nothing to, shall we say, wink at, to ignore. I think maybe some of the problems that we've had in our society today is because Christendom as a whole ignored the great strength and ignored all of that they were doing. I remember a lesson heard years ago by Brother Bert Thompson. And the way in which he started out was that here's little Johnny and Susan, I think were the names that he used, and how that they attended Bible class all of the time, and then they go to school, and they start learning about evolutionary theory, and they come back and they start asking their teachers about, we don't talk about things like that, is basically the idea that was presented. Instead of addressing the problems and the situations that were there, we ignored it. Don't want to deal with it. And as a result, we left a lot of people just totally defenseless when we could have utterly destroyed the arguments and all of the things which Satan would throw at us. If, for example, if you look at evolution, every one of you know one question that will destroy any evolutionist. Know what it is? That's another one that you might ask, but there's another one. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? There's not an evolutionist today that will answer that question. Now, why? Now, it's simple for us to answer, isn't it? Because we know God created the animals and He created the chicken, and so the chicken came first. Evolutionists can't answer it. Because he has to either deny the law of identity, or else he has to deny the law of biogenesis. Now then, the idea of identity is that something that is a non-chicken, in other words, not a chicken, all of a sudden becomes a chicken. Now then, everybody believes that takes place, right? No, it doesn't happen. The other alternative is that a chicken reproduces, or something that's not a chicken reproduces a chicken. How many of you believe that would ever happen? You know what some have called that theory, which I enjoy this terminology, but it's called the hopeful monster theory. because they're hoping for a monster.
I keep wanting to know, when did man decide to become a tree, or a tree become a man? Somewhere you got to get some vegetation in there. They all came from one source, so in that evolutionary process, you got to have a tree and a man.
Right, they would have to have all of that eventually, and they don't address that because they can't. Evolution is an impossible, well, I'll use the term theory. I'll be generous because it's not really a theory. At best, it is a hypothesis. And if you want a scientist to deal with it, he can't. Why? Because the very nature of science itself, no scientist can deal with origins. Because for something to be science, it has to be reproducible. How many times has the creation, we have another creation? And they have to be able to examine it, and they have to be able to falsify it. They can't do anything along that line in regards to evolution. If you're dealing with evolution, actually it's in the realm of philosophy, not science. That's why Brother Thomas B. Warren, he was not a scientist. But there's no evolutionist that wanted to debate him. Why? Because he had his doctorate degree in philosophy. And so he was able to meet their arguments.
That was his question. I came over.
What about Eve? And that was one of the questions he asked. But in reality, I mean, it's simple. Which came first? The chicken or the egg? And they can't answer it. Because in reality, they've got the two choices, and they all know that neither one of them are possible. Got into an argument with an evolutionist on that point. And he sent me to a website that proves it. And so I went there and I read the material. And they didn't answer a question. They couldn't, just like he wasn't able to. But look at today, and you can see the effects because evolution has won the battle, almost. What's taught in school? Evolution. And it's taught as fact, when it's not even it's really a bad hypothesis. Where was the church fighting against this? I've not gone back and read the Scopes monkey trial, if you remember that one. I've seen a movie about it in which Alvin Jennings Bryant, scholarly man, but he in reality believed in the theory of theistic evolution. And so he was so torn up by the defense on that, destroyed him. Why? Because he could not answer simple questions that, for a true theist, someone who believes in the creation, would have been simple to answer. But from that, you get into the moral area. And all of the morals that have just gone to pot today. because we refuse to accept that there is a standard by which we can live. That standard is not by man and his ideas, and that's essentially what evolution comes down to. There are no morals with evolution. Each person is a law to themselves. And so they have struggled through the years to come up with a way in which to live a moral life that is a standard for people to live by. They can't do it. One of the debates, the three main debates that Brother Warren had on this was one who was, his name was Barnhart, I believe, in which it was he was arguing a different philosophy for man to live by. And usually it's, well, whatever the general society says, and what's best for society as a whole, then that's what we ought to do. Of course, they never can answer the question, why? Why should I do what's best for society? Why shouldn't I do what's best for me? They can't answer it. Of course, they can't answer the problem of the Nazis either. Because society then said, as far as the Nazis were concerned, murder all those Jews, along with murdering a whole bunch of other people who were not Jews. We have people of a fierce speech, but they have no substance. Well, God says you're going to see them no more. If we could teach people the principles that are laid out in God's Word, it would put to flight all of these philosophies of men and the immorality, the ungodliness that we face in our society today. The problem is we have a difficulty getting the message out. And I'll just add, we don't get the message out en masse, generally. Now, there's times in which we can, but generally speaking, we don't. What it takes is one person talking to another person, individual basis. Like leaven on bread. It keeps spreading. But the Jews probably did not see the Assyrian army again. Later on, King Manasseh was taken away to Babylon. And he was taken away with chains by the captain of the king of Assyria. We see that in 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 11, where it says, "Wherefore the Lord brought upon them the captains of the host of the king of Assyria, which took Manasseh among the thorns, and bound him with fetters, and carried him to Babylon." So we have that, but Isaiah's generation, they did not see them again. Homer Haley made this application that any people who would thwart God's purpose by trying to destroy his own shall be swept away as the fierce Assyrians were. God's purpose in the saving of souls through Christ in the church, when someone tries to put a stop to it, to destroy it, they are going to be swept away They're going to be done away with. There's no way in which they can succeed. We don't have time to just go through history. But you could say the Romans tried to do it. They tried to stamp out the Jews, even before that, tried to stamp out Christianity. They didn't succeed. Romans tried to do it. They didn't succeed. Roman Catholic Church tried to do it. They didn't succeed. Roman Catholic Church was one of the greatest threats to Christianity, I would say, than anything. The infidels tried to stamp out Christianity. In fact, some of them boasted that they were going to end Christianity, that the Bible would be a relic of the past. And it was going to be done by his works. Anybody know who that might have been? No, wasn't him. Actually, the man who came up with evolution was a believer in the Bible. Charles Darwin. He was a religious person. But Thomas Paine was the person's name. And he predicted that within, I think it was something like 25 years, all the Bibles would be gone. And his age of reason was going to be able to replace it. Anybody ever seen The Age of Reason? Nobody? Neither have I. That's how popular it is, isn't it? Gone away, done away.
Well, the Beatles said you were going to forget Christ. You always remember them. How many people remember the Beatles?
Yeah, the Beatles, they were going to replace Christ. I think they were more popular than Christ. And yet, John Lennon was one of the four. And yet they're gone. People who try to stand against God, against Christ, they will be destroyed. They might not be in the here and now, but there's also coming a judgment in which they will be suffering throughout eternity as a result of what they've done in this life. God will providentially protect his people. You could say much the same thing we said with Christianity regarding the Bible. People have tried to destroy it. Didn't work out for them, and the Bible still exists. Why? Because God providentially preserved it. As Jesus says, my word shall not pass away. Heaven and earth shall pass away, but my words shall not pass away. Matthew 24 and verse 36. We still have the Bible. Now then, I personally believe that one of the greatest threats to the Bible is the Bible translations. That's my personal opinion. I'll tell you for what it's worth. But it lends to confusion many times as to what the Bible actually says. But all of those attacks against the Bible, none of them succeeded. Why? Because God providentially preserved His Word. so that we would have it today and we could read it today. And thus live according to it. Sadly, a lot of people don't. But we at least have that word to appeal to. Say, this is right, this is wrong. This is how we guide our lives. And there's no other ideas by which we can truly guide our life. But that's God's preserving it. God will preserve his people, the church, even as he did Jerusalem in this occasion. And that fierce people, the Assyrians, not see them. They would be done away with. They would end. I know Andrew's about to ring the second bell, so we'll stop at that point, and we'll pick up with verse 20, Lord willing, next time.